Picture the world in the mid-20th century, a time of rapid change and intense global conflict. The ashes of World War II were still warm, and from them sprung a new political landscape. It was a world divided, not by continents or seas, but by ideology, communism and non-communism. The Cold War was more than a chill in the air. It was a tangible curtain that split nations and sowed seeds of distrust. Meanwhile, in the East, the French Indochina War was being fought. A conflict that may seem distant, yet it was here that the first domino was tipped, setting a course for a much larger and more complex conflict. This was a war that not only changed the face of Southeast Asia, but also left an indelible mark on the world stage. It was in this global climate that the seeds of the Vietnam War were sown. As the 1950s rolled in, Vietnam found itself at the center of a growing conflict. Emerging from the throes of French colonial rule, Vietnam was a country divided. The Geneva Accords, a peace treaty signed in 1954, intended to bring temporary peace to Indochina. However, it led to the division of Vietnam along the 17th parallel into North and South. In the North, we see the rise of Ho Chi Minh, a communist leader with a vision of a unified, independent Vietnam. His leadership would spark a zealous following, leading to the formation of the Viet Cong, a guerrilla force with a penchant for insurgency. Meanwhile, in the South, we find Ngo Dinh Diem, a staunch anti-communist leader backed by the United States. Diem's regime, while initially promising, started to unravel through a series of repressive policies and a failure to deliver land reforms, leading to widespread discontent among the populace. As the 1950s transitioned into the 1960s, the United States found itself increasingly entangled in this brewing storm. The domino theory, a guiding principle of U.S. foreign policy, suggested that if one country fell to communism, its neighbors would soon follow. In the context of the Cold War, the thought of a communist Vietnam was a risk the United States was not prepared to take. This fear was further fueled by incidents such as the Gulf of Tonkin incident, where alleged attacks on U.S. naval vessels by North Vietnamese forces led to a significant escalation of American involvement in Vietnam. From diplomatic advisors and financial aid, the United States' role transitioned into active military involvement, a commitment that would lead to one of the most controversial conflicts in modern history. The stage was set for a war that would shape the course of history. The Vietnam War officially began in 1965, but its roots had been growing for decades. As the 1960s progressed, the U.S., under the leadership of Presidents Kennedy and Johnson, increasingly committed resources and troops to the conflict. This period was marked by a series of escalations, with the Gulf of Tonkin incident in 1964 serving as a pivotal catalyst. This incident, in which North Vietnamese forces allegedly attacked U.S. destroyers, led to the U.S. Congress passing the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, effectively giving the president power to wage war without a formal declaration. This heralded the start of major U.S. combat operations, with the first large-scale battle occurring in the Ia Drang Valley in late 1965. The war saw the introduction of new military strategies and technologies. The U.S. relied heavily on air power, using B-52 bombers to carpet bomb enemy positions, and helicopters for rapid troop deployment and evacuation. However, the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong, their South Vietnamese allies, countered with guerrilla tactics, using the dense jungle and complex tunnel systems to their advantage. This made the enemy elusive and difficult to engage using conventional warfare. One of the most significant events was the Tet Offensive in early 1968. This was a series of surprise attacks by the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese forces on cities and military bases throughout South Vietnam. Although the attacks were ultimately repelled, they had a profound psychological impact. They showed that the enemy was far from beaten and could strike anywhere, even the U.S. Embassy in Saigon. The war was not just fought in the jungles of Vietnam, but also on the home front. As casualties mounted and the war dragged on with no clear end in sight, public opinion in the U.S. began to turn against the conflict. Protests became increasingly common, culminating in the massive moratorium to end the war in Vietnam protests in 1969. This domestic unrest, coupled with the lack of progress on the battlefield, led to a gradual shift in U.S. strategy. From 1969, under the Nixon administration, the U.S. began to Vietnamese the war, transferring more responsibility to the South Vietnamese while gradually withdrawing U.S. troops. In the midst of these dramatic events, the role of the United States allies should not be overlooked. Australia, New Zealand, and South Korea, among others, also committed troops to the conflict, each for their own reasons and each with their own impact on the course of the war. The Vietnam War was unlike any conflict the world had seen before. Its complexities, from the guerrilla tactics of the Viet Cong to the political machinations at home and abroad, challenged traditional notions of warfare and reshaped the global stage. It was a war that left indelible marks, not only on those who fought it, but also on those who watched from afar. By the early 1970s, it became clear that the Vietnam War was not a conflict that could be easily won. Even the most optimistic of strategists began to realize that victory was elusive. This understanding led to a pivotal moment in history: the Paris Peace Accords of 1973. These accords, negotiated between the United States, South Vietnam, North Vietnam, and the Viet Cong, were designed to bring about a ceasefire and establish a framework for peace. They marked the official end of the United States' active military involvement in Vietnam. Over the course of the next few months, American troops began to withdraw, marking the first step towards the end of the war. Yet, the peace was tenuous at best. In the absence of American troops, the conflict continued between North and South Vietnam. By 1975, North Vietnamese forces launched a full-scale offensive. The South, without the military support of the United States, was unable to withstand the onslaught. The culmination of the North's campaign was the fall of Saigon in April of 1975. This marked the end of the Vietnam War and the start of a new era for the country. Vietnam was unified under the rule of the Communist Party with the capital in Hanoi. The aftermath of the war was fraught with challenges. The country faced economic difficulties and social unrest. The unification process was not smooth, with many South Vietnamese facing retribution for their perceived support of the United States. Yet, despite these challenges, Vietnam began the long process of rebuilding and healing. The Vietnam War ended, but its impact was far from over. The echoes of this conflict continued to reverberate, influencing not just Vietnam, but the world at large, shaping our understanding of war, peace, and the human capacity for resilience. The Vietnam War left a lasting impact, both in the nations directly involved and around the world. With millions of lives lost, the human cost of this conflict was devastating. Vietnam bore the brunt of this loss, with a significant portion of its population perishing or suffering from the effects of war. The physical scars of the war etched onto Vietnam's landscape were parallel to the social and economic upheavals the country faced. The devastation of infrastructure and agriculture led to years of economic hardship. Yet Vietnam, resilient and steadfast, embarked on a journey of recovery, rebuilding itself from the ashes of war. Across the Pacific, the United States grappled with its own set of repercussions. The war sparked a wave of anti-war sentiment and civil unrest, forever changing the social and cultural fabric of the nation. It marked a turning point in the relationship between the government and its people, igniting a widespread skepticism and disillusionment that still resonates today. On a global scale, the Vietnam War served as a stark reminder of the horrors of war, influencing international policies and military strategies. It shifted the paradigm of warfare, with nations growing increasingly wary of direct military interventions. The war also brought about a change in media coverage of conflicts, with the graphic images from Vietnam resonating worldwide and influencing public opinion. Politically, the war exposed the limitations of military power in achieving political objectives. It led to a re-evaluation of foreign strategies, especially in the United States. resulting in a more cautious approach to international conflicts. Culturally, the war seeped into every aspect of life, influencing arts, literature, and cinema. It gave rise to a new wave of war literature and cinema, reflecting the raw and brutal realities of warfare. The Vietnam War, a chapter of history that continues to shape our world today. Its legacy, imprinted in the hearts and minds of those it touched, serves as a poignant reminder of the cost of war and the resilience of the human spirit in the face of adversity.